Are you holding yourself back? We tend to impose limits on our achievement and our happiness by adopting a needless or unnecessary sense of pessimism in our lives. Today, I want to talk to you about optimism. I want to talk to you about why this is so important that we nurture a sense of optimism in our psychology for long-term happiness and achievement. I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of optimism, and then I'm going to talk to you about a specific technique that you can use to improve your own sense of optimism. Watch this video to learn more. Martin Seligman is often considered as the father of positive psychology. So what is positive psychology? Well, historically, psychology has looked at kind of mental illness. So depression, anxiety, all sorts of other neuroses that some people suffer from and need help to recover from. But more recently, there has been a new movement called the positive psychology movement, which is focusing a lot more on how people actually flourish. This is about how people design awesome lives for themselves, how they become happier, how they can achieve more, how they can be more successful. The fundamental message that's coming from the positive psychology movement is that optimism and happiness is a skill. It's a skill that can be learnt and cultivated in anyone. But firstly, why is it so important to be optimistic? What are the benefits of optimism? There are some fundamental differences between optimists and pessimists. Let me run through some of the differences right now. Pessimists tend to give up more easily and get depressed more often. There's a big study of scientific research to show that our immune system may work better when we are optimistic. Evidence also suggests that optimists live longer than pessimists do. Optimists tend to do better at school, they get higher grades. And at work, they're more successful. And on the playing field with sports, they tend to do better there too. Optimists tend to achieve more than pessimists do. Optimists have better relationships than pessimists. People tend to like optimists more. And optimists are generally happier and having a more fulfilling life. So all these benefits are very well and good, but what actually is optimism? When I'm talking about optimism now, let's ground this discussion and give a definition of what optimism is. Well, essentially, optimism is all about control. An optimistic person believes that they have control over everything around them. They believe they have control over their situation. They believe they have control over their life. Optimists are very empowered people. They believe that they can afflict changes onto their environment. They believe that they have the power to do that. Pessimists, on the other hand, are the opposite. Pessimists come from a state of helplessness. They believe that they can't change anything. They believe that they are at the mercy of what's around them, at the mercy of their environment. They believe that if something happens to them, they are powerless to change that or improve that situation. In short, pessimistic people believe that they are helpless victims. So the question obviously becomes then, can we train ourselves to be more optimistic, or is it just a fixed characteristic in all of us? Well, that's an interesting question, and to answer that, firstly I want to talk about a study that Martin Seligman and his compatriots did with dogs. They took two sets of dogs and put one set in a compartment or a cage that they could escape from, and they put another set of dogs in a compartment that they couldn't escape from. Both sets of dogs were delivered an electric shock, and how the dogs behaved was monitored. The dogs that were in the compartment that could be escaped from, as soon as the shock was administered, they jumped out and they got away from the shock. The dogs in the other compartment, in the compartment that couldn't be escaped from, they tried to escape for a while, but in the end they just gave up and they lay down and they were just at mercy to the shocks that were administered to them. Both of these sets of dogs were then taken to another room and another compartment which was easily escapable from, so any of the dogs could jump out as soon as the electric shock was administered. But what was interesting is that only the dogs that previously could escape jumped out in this second experiment. The dogs that couldn't escape in the first experiment didn't even try to escape, even though they could easily jump out of the box. This is a very interesting finding because these dogs had been taught pessimism. They had been taught helplessness. Even though they were in a situation that they could escape from very easily, they didn't even try because they had been conditioned not to in the first experiment. So here they trained pessimism in these dogs. How about the opposite? Could they then train optimistic dogs that just never give up in any situation? Well, that's exactly what they did. They found that they could nurture not only pessimism, but optimism through previous experiences. Well, of course, teaching dogs pessimism and optimism is one thing, but how does this transfer to humans? Well, it turns out there are two essential components to teaching and nurturing optimism in humans. One is called explanatory style, and the second is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's what I want to talk to you about now. So firstly, let's talk about your explanatory style. So this is your habitual way of explaining events that happen to you. So if something occurs in your life, if you have a setback or adversity, how do you actually explain that to yourself? Why do you actually believe that that event happened? If you're a pessimistic person, you explain these things as permanent, pervasive, and personal. If you're an optimistic person, you explain these things as temporary, isolated, and non-personal. So this becomes a lot clearer with an example. So let's say we have somebody, Katie, who has been on a diet for the last 2 weeks. She goes out bowling or she goes out with her friends to the restaurant and she just has a huge blowout and ends up eating a bunch of food that wasn't part of her diet. How does she explain that to herself? What's her explanatory style? Well, if she's a pessimist, she might explain it like this. You sure blew your diet tonight. I am so unbelievably weak. I can't even go to a bar with some friends without making a total glutton of myself. They must think I'm such a fool. Well, all my dieting over the last 2 weeks is blown now. So I might as well really make a pig of myself and eat the cake in the freezer. So let's break this down. How is she explaining this to herself? I am so unbelievably weak. I can't even go to a bar with some friends without making a total glutton of myself. Notice here how she is attacking herself. She's personally putting a lot of blame onto herself. She's not showing any compassion. She's really making herself feel guilty about this and hammering it home so she feels bad. The next interesting remark is, well, all my dieting over the last 2 weeks is blown now. Here she's blowing the problem up. She had a little bit extra food on one night, but now she's basically saying that her whole diet is blown now and that's the end of it. Notice how she's making a crisis of the situation. She's catastrophizing here. She's making it bigger than it actually is. And the last important remark is, I might as well really make a pig of myself and eat the cake in the freezer. So here she's making the whole problem permanent and she's just giving up on the whole thing. So let's flip this around. What if she's an optimist? Well, she might say something like this. First of all, I did not make a total glutton of myself at the bar. I drank 2 light beers and ate a couple of chicken wings and a couple of nachos. I didn't have dinner, so I think on balance I probably consumed only a few more calories than my diet allows. Letting my diet slip for one night doesn't mean I am weak. Think how strong I am in sticking to it so strictly for 2 weeks. Furthermore, no one thinks I'm a fool. I doubt anyone was keeping tabs on what I was eating, and in fact a couple of people mentioned how I look slimmer. So let's break this down and unpack this. The first remark. First of all, I did not make a total glutton of myself at the bar. I drank 2 light beers and ate a couple of chicken wings and a couple of nachos. Here she's doing the opposite of what the pessimist did. She's making light of the situation. She's making the situation really small. The problems just seem really small and insignificant. She's saying, I didn't really eat much. It was only one night. It's not a big deal. It's just a little blip. No problem. The second remark. Letting my diet slip for more than one night doesn't mean I am weak. Notice how this explanation is a temporary one. It's just one night, just one slip up. It doesn't really matter. The final remark, think how strong I am in sticking to it so strictly for 2 weeks. Here she's not blaming herself. In fact, she's doing the opposite. She's saying, well, I did this for 2 weeks. She's got personal compassion. She's actually her own biggest supporter. That's a complete difference or turnaround from the pessimist who basically layered blame and guilt on her conscience. So the important thing to realize is that the event of going out and eating too much food in one night hasn't changed. It's just the way the event has been explained to herself that's changed. The pessimistic person makes it a permanent, huge and personal problem, whereas the optimistic version of her makes it a temporary, small, non-pervasive and non-personal problem. It's something that's just a blip in the road that can easily be overcome. That's the big major difference between someone who is optimistic and someone who is pessimistic. The way we explain things to ourselves is how we measure how optimistic we are. And the great news about this is that there's a very, very specific technique that we can use to improve our optimism. It's very simple, but it's very, very effective. And that's what I want to talk to you about now. So the technique that we can use to become more optimistic is actually called cognitive behavioral therapy. See, when we explain things to ourselves, when we have this explanatory style, often these thoughts are automatic and they happen below our level of consciousness. It's like an automatic reaction. Something bad happens and instantly we come up with a reason why it's happened. And usually we're completely unaware that this is happening. But what cognitive behavioral therapy teaches us is to elevate our sense of consciousness so that we can catch these thoughts as they are happening. We can catch them and we can figure out, are these useful thoughts? And if they're not, we can reframe them to be useful. We can reframe them to have a more optimistic state of mind. There are 5 main key points to how cognitive behavioral therapy works, and I'm going to run through them right now. Firstly, you learn to recognize thoughts that are going through your mind when you feel bad, when bad things happen to you. So in other words, you learn to recognize your explanatory style at the point that these thoughts pop into your head. Secondly, once you've caught these thoughts, you learn to dispute them by finding evidence to the contrary. So you have these thoughts that aren't helping you, perhaps they're pessimistic or they're bringing you down, and you learn to dispute these thoughts by finding evidence to the contrary, by looking for evidence that supports a different hypothesis to this non-useful thought that you're having. Thirdly, you then learn to reattribute these explanations. So you've identified and dismissed your original belief or explanation. And now you look for an alternative, you find an alternative, more positive explanation, and you look for evidence to support this. Fourthly, you learn how to distract yourself from depressing thoughts. There are techniques that you can use to do this. And finally, you learn to recognize and question the assumptions that lead you to depressive thinking. So everything I've covered here about cognitive behavioral therapy is actually very conceptual. In my next video, I'm going to give you a very practical exercise that you can use. It's called the ABC exercise that will help you to become more optimistic. I can't cover that in this video because it's quite in depth, but in my next video, I'll be going through that with you. The fundamental thing to realize here though is that you can become more optimistic by using cognitive behavioral therapy and changing your explanatory style. So the next question is, it seems like optimism is very important. Is it the be-all and end-all? Should I always be optimistic in every situation? Well, that's a very good question, and the answer to that is no. Let's consider an airline pilot. We're about 2,000 pounds overweight, but I'm optimistic that we're going to clear that mountain at the end of the runway. Or let's consider the drink driver. Yeah, I've had 15 cans of beers, but I'm optimistic about my ability to drive home tonight. No problem. Or you could even look at the cheating spouse. Yeah, I'm cheating on my husband, and if he ever finds out, then our relationship is over and our family will be broken up. But I'm optimistic that he won't find out. These 3 situations are great examples of where you really don't want to be using optimism. The fundamental guideline for not deploying optimism is to ask yourself, what is the cost of failure? If there's a high cost of failure, then it's best not to be optimistic and to adopt a more pessimistic attitude. So let's wrap this video up. Today we've spoken about positive psychology and how it's helping people create flourishing lives. People with a healthy psychology learn how to create happier and more fulfilling lives. We've spoken about how optimistic people are happier and generally achieve more, and how optimistic people have a feeling of control, whereas pessimistic people feel helpless. They feel like they're a victim of their circumstances. Your explanatory style, or the way you explain events and things that happen to you, is what determines your level of optimism. You can improve your explanatory style to be more optimistic by using what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, to make your explanations less permanent, more temporary, non-pervasive, and non-personal. This is an absolutely fantastic book. Many years of research has gone into this. I really recommend you pick it up. And the thing I find really fascinating is that I'm starting to see, by reading all these books, how various different people from different areas are all kind of coming together to the same conclusion. In this book, Learned Optimism, we realize that optimistic people feel like they have control. In another book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, we realize that highest performers, the people that get better grades, the people that are the most successful, have what's called a growth mindset. And what does that actually mean? That means they feel like they have control over their ability. We're starting to see a pattern emerging here with all this evidence stacking up. We have more control over our ability than we think. And I keep talking about this like a stuck record, and I'm going to keep talking about it even more because this is an incredibly empowering thought. Not only do we have more control over our ability than we think, but what we've realized in this book is that we actually have the ability to nurture this belief that we have more control over our ability than we think. That's a pretty powerful combination. I just wanted to leave you with that thought. I hope you enjoyed this video and you also picked this book up. I think it's a fantastic book. I really learned a lot from it. And finally, subscribe to my channel. I haven't asked you to do this before, but now I want you to subscribe to my channel because I'm going to be delivering on a weekly basis stuff like this, where I'm spending a lot of time myself, hours per day essentially, reading all these books, and I want to deliver this information to you in informative documentary type videos like this. My goal is to deliver all this wisdom and information that I glean from all these books in a very, very efficient and compact format for you, so that you don't have to spend 5 or 6 hours going through the information yourself. So subscribe to this channel, and every week I'll be giving you more videos like this. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.